Good evening, everybody. James Hancock here. Just caught one of my most hotly anticipated movies of the year, and this is a movie I'm sure that my thoughts and feelings on will evolve quite a bit in the days, weeks, perhaps even years to come, but I just saw Blade Runner 2049 from director Denis Villeneuve, and before I get to general impressions, or before I get to spoilers, or any of that, I'll just say from the word go, the good news is he didn't fuck it up. When I saw him present at San Diego Comic-Con this past summer at the Blade Runner panel, when asked why he would attempt to do a sequel to such a beloved, acknowledged classic, his very short answer was, I didn't want to see somebody else fuck it up. So, congrats to Denis Villeneuve. He did not fuck it up, and there's a lot about this movie that I can't wait to discuss. So I'll start with just some general, broad impressions overall, and then I'll give a nice big fat warning before I dive into any major spoilers and/or specifics. So where to begin with a sequel to an acknowledged classic? I mean, the original Blade Runner from 1982 has probably had as big an impact on film as, say, Dune had on science fiction literature in the 1960s. Whether you're talking about comic books or video games or cinema, just Blade Runner-esque has become an adjective over the last 35 years. And it's that rare thing where it's a film noir hybrid with science fiction that probes the meanings of existence and the conflict between the creator and their creations. It's just a profound piece of cinema. No matter what angle you are approaching Blade Runner from, it's an absolute masterwork in so many ways, and you could probably make a case for it having inspired and influenced as many filmmakers since its release as perhaps a film like Citizen Kane did in the 60s and 70s, when you had the film school generation who absolutely loved and adored that particular movie. There are probably a lot of directors to this day, Denis Villeneuve included, who rank Blade Runner as one of the most important, influential films they've ever been exposed to. I first caught it in the summer of 92 or summer 93 when I first had the chance to see the director's cut in the theater, which was a killer experience. So this is a movie that I've been thinking about and talking about for 25 years now. So to try to do a compare and contrast between a movie that I've seen a lot and know really well and a movie that I just saw is probably very unfair to Blade Runner 2049. However, this is a review, so we're going to get down to it. Going into it, I had two major concerns. One was, would they lose the ambiguity and the mystery that has made the first film such a great source of debate ever since its release? And my other concern was, is Denis Villeneuve too serious for the material? Denis Villeneuve is a very serious guy, and sometimes can be a little slow and boring, if I'm being totally frank. And so I was a little bit concerned as to whether or not he would have the youthful vitality and energy to hurl himself into this monumental project. I mean, the fact that this movie even exists shows that somebody somewhere has enormous balls of steel. This is a $185 million production estimated, that is R-rated, that is 2 hours and 40 minutes long, that is intensely cerebral and ambitious. The fact that this movie even exists, that alone is a miracle and should be applauded. And the fact that Denis Villeneuve made a movie that I think is a very worthy sequel to the original film, that is the biggest miracle of all, because I can't imagine the creative pressure, the professional pressure of embarking upon this project. And the fact that it's not a total disaster is amazing. The fact that it's good, I'm still kind of, it's kind of taking my breath away that I don't have to be depressed all night, because I've been embracing myself to be depressed ever since they announced that they were going to make this movie. So broad general strokes before I get to any specifics, I'll say this is a much darker movie. For those of you who don't know, it takes place well after the original Blade Runner, and this is an even more apocalyptic dystopian vision of the future compared to the first one. The first one is practically Disneyland in tone and style and atmosphere in comparison to this new iteration. It's a world where cities have quite literally gone completely dark. Yet, cinematographer Roger Deakins has delivered some of the finest work of his career, and this is a guy who has routinely been delivering some of the finest photography of any DP of the last 25 years. He's an absolute master of his craft, and he and Denis Villeneuve have just made a very harmonious partnership on this film. Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford are just the dynamic duo. I grew up watching Harrison Ford movies, so to see him in his twilight years doing films like The Force Awakens or doing films like Blade Runner just makes me a very, very happy fanboy in a lot of ways. But the supporting cast is extraordinary, and I'll be getting into more details in a few minutes. But Sylvia Hawkes, if I'm saying her name correctly, she's great. Robin Wright's really good. But Ana de Armas was phenomenal, and I'll be getting into more reasons why in just a sec. If I were to offer one broad general criticism before getting into specifics, I would say there were times where I felt the length. There was a person behind me snoring like a madman, which gave me an eerie sense of deja vu, because when I went to see Arrival, the exact same thing happened, where somebody behind me just couldn't handle it and was just conked out, just ripping cloth inside their lungs. Same thing happened tonight. So Denis Villeneuve is clearly not for everybody. He's not one of those directors who wants to grab you by the lapels of your coat and shake you. It's a more meditative trance he wants to put you into, and for some people that's not necessarily going to be what they're looking for. I think a lot of people are going to go see this not even knowing what they're looking for. I imagine the hardcore Blade Runner community, for lack of a better word, will be really into it, because they will at least respect the ambition of the attempt, even if they might have their own personal grievances or nitpicks. I think overall they'll just be stunned by the fact that they've got yet another giant, colossal science fiction epic to dissect and sink their teeth into for many years to come. So I think I'm ready to get into some details. So I'll just say, thoroughly enjoyed the movie. I would say the movie's more impressive than entertaining. It's not necessarily a fun movie, but it is an awe-inspiring movie. It's a different kind of feeling. It's like the feeling you get when you walk into a giant cathedral as opposed to walking into a nightclub. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what to expect. But let's talk a little bit about what makes this movie so fascinating. By some miracle, I went into this movie totally spoiler-free. Usually I devour each and every little scrap of information about a movie that I can prior to its release. But that tends to be more the slightly more fanboy type movies like the Marvel films, where I'm not expecting a great artistic masterpiece. I just want the lore and the story. But with Blade Runner, I decided I wasn't going to read any reviews, and that I was just going to go in totally cold, because I just wanted to go in with a nice, raw, open frame of mind and just have an honest experience. And I love the fact that we have Ryan Gosling, who is a replicant hunting down his own kind. We have a situation where a generation of replicants is living a very long time, and there's now this curveball, or this mystery, that Ryan Gosling's character has discovered, where he suspects that replicants have managed to reproduce, which is something that Jared Leto's character has been trying to do for a very long time. There are only so many replicants he can make, but if he could unlock the secret of reproduction, that would allow mankind to essentially conquer the stars. They've conquered 9 worlds with the help of replicants, but if they could reproduce, that would accelerate their expansion. But because of this giant blackout that occurred after the events of the first movie, some of the secrets of the original Tyrell Corporation have been lost. Tyrell, the building, is completely dark, which was a very ominous, beautiful thing to see. And I don't think enough can be said about just how physically beautiful this movie is in terms of the lighting, the production design, the shot composition. People are going to be slack-jawed throughout the majority of this movie. But the movie basically is a mystery story. It's punctuated by a little bit of action. But Gosling's character, Kay, which is part of his serial number, it's mostly the story of following him from place to place as he's piecing together certain clues, all of which eventually leads him to the story of Deckard and Rachel. But what's interesting is that as much as that might be the main thrust of the story, is trying to figure out, did they reproduce and what's the identity of this child they created, it wasn't necessarily the story that I was most interested in. The story that really interested me the most, by far, was Kay's relationship with a virtual holographic person named Joy. Joy is played by Ana de Armas, and it's basically like having a live-in companion who's totally virtual, that you can't physically interact with, but due to a device that he gets for her, it basically allows her to travel with him wherever he goes. And they actually have a legitimate, genuine love story that I found to be profoundly moving. I mean, this movie can be a little cold and a little distant, except for this one storyline where I was completely mesmerized from start to finish of that particular arc. Because in the end, these Blade Runner movies are about life. What is the definition of life? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be a human being? How do you define yourself as a human being? And this movie definitely grapples with all those weighty topics very thoroughly. I should also say this movie's wildly erotic compared to the first movie. This movie's got nudity left and right. I was genuinely caught off guard by the fact, Because usually with a big, giant, marquee studio movie like this, you are just not going to get nudity at all. It's a big no-no because it definitely restricts your potential audience. There is a beautiful scene where Joy basically calls a prostitute to their home, and they have this fascinating merging sequence where basically she and the living, breathing person merge in a way where you can kind of see them both moving, talking, and acting at the precise same time. It basically allows Kay to have one night with Joy, a night he would have never had otherwise. And I think it might be the most beautiful scene in the entire film. Another badass character who I mentioned earlier is played by Sylvia Hawkes, or Hoax, whatever, however you pronounce her last name, but she plays basically the most badass replicant of them all, named Love, and she reports to Jared Leto's character, Neander Wallace. And she's like basically like the Terminator, where she's just taking anything out in their way that might prevent them from unlocking the secret that Wallace is so desperate to unlock. I wouldn't say she is as complex or interesting as Roy Batty, and that's probably unfair because Roy Batty is arguably the most complex, fascinating character in the history of science fiction in cinema, period. And I don't even know if there's a close second. So she is no substitute for Roy Batty. However, she looks totally badass. She has this incredible intensity. She's ferocious in combat. There's all these crazy outside crescent kicks, and she's just a very physical, commanding presence. So I thoroughly enjoyed watching her in action. But best of all, Ryan Gosling and Harrison Ford are just doing what they do. If you are a Ryan Gosling fan or you're a Harrison Ford fan, you're going to be happy. I wouldn't say they necessarily deliver the finest work of their careers, but they're both. You can tell they really enjoyed working together, and Ryan Gosling is basically like a younger version of what Harrison Ford was a few decades ago. And I imagine Ryan Gosling just in his mind as he was acting out the scenes was just like, please don't fuck this up, please don't fuck this up. Like, the pressure on everybody involved in this film must have just been enormous. Now, a few little grievances that I have because I don't want to oversell this film. The music, I felt, was not nearly as spectacular as the music in the original film, which once again is an unfair comparison because the music in the original film is some of the best music ever recorded for a movie. But that magical quality that the music gave in the first film, I felt was missing. There's one of my favorite scenes from the original Blade Runner. It's Deckard just hanging out on his deck, drinking a glass of whiskey as a car flies by, and you just hear this very cool atmospheric music. And it's just a great quiet moment that establishes the atmosphere and the tone and the mood of the movie. And this movie doesn't necessarily have those beats that I was really craving. In the end, the first Blade Runner for me is like visual and audio ecstasy in a lot of ways, when just the music and the imagery comes together in such a way that you are spellbound. And this movie just wasn't quite going for that sense of euphoria, except for in one scene where Kay is interacting with this giant holographic projection that is reminiscent of his girlfriend Joy, and that was particularly jaw-dropping. My other little nitpicky grievance about it is that there's this subplot of a potential revolution with all the replicants rising up and basically shattering the status quo and throwing off their shackles and chains, and they just don't develop it very thoroughly. There's a scene where Kay basically gets recruited to a small army, and we never see them again or really know what their goals are or what their strategy is going to be. I got all I needed about the threat to the status quo in the conversation between Robin Wright's character, Lieutenant Joji, and Kay, where they're talking about what it could mean if replicants suddenly are basically living, breathing creatures with the possibility of reproduction. That obviously would change their dynamic with humanity quite a bit. And so these revolution scenes, there's no real payoff on them, so I don't know why they needed to add those little extra scenes, because I got all that I needed on that front from just people talking about the threat. Nonetheless, it's a small grievance. I just felt like it was one of the things that they introduced but then just did nothing with. And I don't know if I need to see some giant revolution like off in space of replicants tearing apart some ship that they're working on, but I just felt like there needed to be some sort of payoff since they introduced all those characters. So overall, I found it to be a fascinating movie. As I mentioned before, I was very impressed with it. In a lot of ways, at times almost overwhelmed by the experience. But I didn't like run out of the theater hopping and skipping, having had this sense of euphoria. And not that every movie needs to deliver that, but that it is what I feel after seeing Blade Runner. I'll never forget when I was an undergrad going to see a screening of Blade Runner early in the morning, and the entire theater was packed, and you could have heard a pin drop. I mean, the crowd was just completely, totally entranced. It's one of the most magnetic movie-going experiences I've ever had, just feeling the atmosphere of the room as people just got sucked into this otherworldly vision. And there's just not a lot of movies that manage to create that. But I'm very curious to see how I react on multiple viewings of this movie. Obviously, I will return to it many times because this is a movie that needs to be digested and absorbed and analyzed and thought about and discussed. So as I mentioned in the beginning, my thoughts and feelings on it will very likely evolve and change in the days to come. Definitely in the days to come, but certainly over a longer period of time as well. So now I guess I'm ready for Denis Villeneuve to take a crack at Dune. I know it's one of the possible projects that he is considering following this up with. He's also talked about doing Cleopatra. He's got a couple different stokes in the fire. But if he can handle Blade Runner 2049, then he can definitely handle Frank Herbert's Dune. Granted, that's just a monumental Herculean task. It's just this giant tome with a million different characters and all this incredible complexity. I mean, if you're going to do Dune, I feel like it needs to be like a 10-hour miniseries. But if Denis Villeneuve wants to take a crack at it, I'll watch it. I'll see what he can do. In any case, I'm going to wrap this sucker up. Hope you enjoyed my reaction and review. Please let me know in the comments below. I feel like this is one of those movies that needs to be intensely discussed for a long time. And I'm just so thrilled that this movie even exists because these kind of experiments on a giant scale almost never happen. And so we should just appreciate it and cherish this opportunity while it lasts. So thank you so much for watching my review. I really appreciate it. Give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax. Talk to y'all soon.